because no one in my family that did it, no one in my family went to college. I was very tolerant. Southern California. My master's USC.
So, thank you all very much for coming here tonight. So, I'll first tell you a quick word about Think Liberal, the association of which I'm part. So, Think Liberal is the libertarian association of Sciences Po. So we organize conferences. Recently we had a conference about the crisis, and we'll have a conference on the 21st of March in Reims on the currency war and quantitative easing. And we also organize different events and different projects, and one of them was the Free Startup project, which Christophe is going to tell you a quick word about, as he's the founder and organizer of it.
Thank you. I'm switching to French. J'ai l'habitude de dire que je suis un anarchiste pragmatique, donc effectivement, Think Libéral Sciences Po fait partie d'un réseau de communautés qui sont toutes autonomes avec les Students for Liberty de France, et qui est un réseau international aussi, donc qui diffuse effectivement en particulier des idées libérales, mais qui s'attache à monter des projets concrets. Comment est-ce qu'on va aller voir des mecs qui sont dans la blockchain, dans le bitcoin, je sais pas, des localistes qui s'étiquettent de gauche ou qu'on étiquette de gauche? Comment ces gens-là qui sont assez anti-autorité centrale montent déjà des projets, des applications, tout, n'importe quoi? Et comment est-ce que nous on peut faire la même chose? Donc c'est pour ça qu'avec le Free Startup Project, dont était partenaire Think Libéral Sciences Po l'an passé, on a monté une première édition et on en a plein à venir de startup week-end indépendants. Et où l'idée c'est vraiment de mettre des gens tous ensemble, des profils très différents, et en un week-end, à la fin, ils ont un business model, ils ont un pitch, et ils ont un prototype d'application. Voilà, ça pourrait être aussi des associations. Donc l'idée c'est vraiment de changer le monde aujourd'hui avec nos idées, indépendamment de l'agenda politique. Parce qu'on ne fait pas de la politique directement, donc on fait de la politique puisqu'on crée des opportunités et qu'on fait vivre les gens ensemble. Et donc il y a un deuxième projet qui est un tout petit peu lié, qu'on est en train de monter. Si ça vous intéresse, n'hésitez pas à demander à Patrick, à Fautry Directorate ou à tout le bureau, tout le politburo de Think Libéral Sciences Po, et qui s'appelle Make Business Not War, et qui a pour mission, alors on est en train de recopier plus ou moins ce qui se fait par ailleurs avec un café, un contact, et l'idée c'est aller chercher des mecs qui sont en banlieue, qui sont paumés, qui sont en dehors d'un système d'éducation, qui ne savent pas quoi faire de leur vie, et de pouvoir leur faire rencontrer quelqu'un qui lui est dans l'emploi, quelqu'un qui sur un domaine qui les intéresse, une passion, je sais pas, s'ils sont gamers, qu'est-ce qu'ils peuvent faire avec les jeux vidéo, peut-être même sans diplôme, pour gagner leur vie et pour avoir un engagement. Donc voilà, l'idée c'est de matcher des gens qui sont dans l'emploi avec des gens qui ne sont pas dans l'emploi, et la question du diplôme n'est pas forcément la réponse. Et ça fera peut-être l'objet d'une autre conférence, mais voilà, l'idée c'est d'apprendre à apprendre tout le temps, et c'est de diffuser ce mindset-là, qui n'est pas forcément académique, mais qui peut beaucoup changer les choses et qui peut permettre de montrer qu'on n'a pas toujours besoin d'institutions, ou qu'on peut créer des institutions fantômes, entre guillemets, des associations, tout type de projets, pour répondre à ce qu'a priori on pense être une problématique ou une mission de l'État ou des pouvoirs publics. Voilà. Merci pour votre attention et n'hésitez pas à redemander à Patrick ou à moi-même plus d'informations.
Merci beaucoup. So tonight we're here to speak about education, because education is vital to our society. As individuals, education is vital to have enlightened, reasonable people. It is vital for the economy to allow an easy and swift integration onto the labour market. And it is vital to democracy, because well-informed, rational and enlightened citizens are at the core of the democratic project. However, we all know education and democracy are in a poor state in France. All the peace writings have always been downgrading France. Despite the influence of Bourdieu, France is the country with the most unequal education system in the peace rankings. And so we need to figure out, therefore, new solutions for education. We need to work out how to get education back on track. We need to work out how to make education great again. Somebody else. So, and this is why Calle and Salinas are here with us tonight, and thank you very much for being here. So Brian Calle is, does many things. He's, among other things, the opinion editor and the vice president of the Orange County Register, quite a big American newspaper. And he's also a speaker for the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice. Now, this was founded in 1995 by Milton Friedman, the Nobel Laureate Prize in Economics, and his wife Rosa Friedman, in order to promote what's called the school voucher, among other things. This idea of the school voucher has been defended by many people, among others Steve Jobs, who called it, I quote, the best thing we could ever do. And so now I'll let Gustave quickly present Monsieur Salinas.
So Daniel Salinas is a policy analyst in the Directorate for Education and Skills at the OECD. He's currently working on the PISA thematic report series, and most recently authored a report on low-performing students, why they fall behind, and how to succeed. A very important topic, of course. Daniel received his PhD in Education Theory and Policy and Comparative and International Education from Penn State University after studying in Chile, and we are extremely pleased that he is here tonight to talk about education and its future.
So the conference will be divided in 3 different parts. First, Monsieur Salinas and Monsieur Calle will quickly present their ideas. Then it will be followed by a brief discussion between Monsieur Salinas and Monsieur Calle, and we'll ask a few questions. And then we'll let you ask questions. So, if you'd like, Monsieur.
And this conference is also managed by Terra, which is another think tank in South. And we are mostly progressists, but we also want to participate in this conference.
Well, thanks for the invitation. Thanks everybody for coming. I do work in the OECD, and I also work in PISA, in the PISA study, which is not only a ranking, it's also a study on the quality and on the equity of education, on what are the factors and the kinds of policies and practices that promote quality and equity in education across countries. And school choice, this idea of introducing competition between schools, the idea that private schools might be more efficient in some cases or more innovative than public schools, has been a policy that has been discussed extensively during the last few decades, or at least the last 2 decades. And PISA has provided, since it started in the year 2000, a range of evidence on different topics that relate to this discussion and that have implications for this discussion. 2 ways in which PISA measures the quality and the equity. This is a simple graph that looks on the vertical axis to the mean mathematical performance, so the level of performance in a country. On the horizontal axis, the level of equity in a country, in an education system, basically. And distributes all the country that participates in the study, depending on whether they have higher levels of performance and equity or lower levels of performance and equity. And you can see that there's basically a whole range of countries located in different quadrants of this figure. The case of France, for example, is about the OECD average in terms of performance, and actually a little lower or less levels of equity compared to the OECD average. I have like a pointer to, I don't know if this allows me to, yeah. This would be France right here, right? You can see the hand. Anyway, so then the question is, so what are the policies that would allow countries to move towards this higher quadrant where they would get high levels of performance and greater levels of equity, right? Actually, this one of the findings of this figure is that it is possible to achieve both things. So in terms of whether higher levels of some of the policies associated with school choice, vouchers, private schooling. So these are some of the questions that PISA has addressed and has evidence about. One is how large is the student enrollment in private schools across countries? So what's the magnitude of the kinds of policies we're talking about? Do students in private schools perform better than students in public schools? Do school competition and parental choice increase socioeconomic inequalities in education, which has been one of the concerns of critics of these kinds of policies? And do some kinds of school choice policies work better than others? Right. So I'm going to go through all of these questions in my presentation. The kind of data that PISA brings to the table to discuss these policies is basically this. PISA is an assessment on student achievement in different subjects, mathematics, reading, and science. 15-year-old students are part of these studies. These are not primary school students. These are basically, for the most part, secondary students, secondary school students. In addition, PISA conducts a survey with students, families, and schools to collect data on a number of characteristics about the schools, about the family, including, for example, the levels of education of the parents, the occupation of the parents, and one of those things is whether the schools are public or private. It's important when interpreting these results that this is a cross-sectional study, and therefore the evidence that's provided by the study is only of a correlational nature. These are not causal inferences, so a number of other variables can be confounding some of the findings here. That's just a basic epistemological consideration. And more than 60 countries and economies are part of this study. So basically, anything that we look at, we find always like an important variation and a wide number of differences between countries. So we do use the OECD average in general as a benchmark for comparison. So how do we look at private schools? We ask the principals of the schools two questions. One is whether this is a public and a private school. And the second question is what percentage of the funding of the school comes from public sources. And that, based on that evidence and information, we build basically three categories of school type, two different types of private schools, private independent and private dependent, where independent are those that do not receive funding from the government, private dependent are those that do receive most of their funding from the government, and then just traditional public schools. So when you look at enrollment, this is actually very important, that's distinction. This graph represents the percentage of students enrolled in private schools. What you see here, but there are different messages. One is that in most countries, most students attend public schools, right? If you look at the OECD average, 4% of students go to private schools that charge fee and do not receive funding from the government. 14% of students go to private dependent school, a total of 18% in private schools on the OECD. There are many countries in which less than 10% of students attend private schools, 36 countries. There are 20 countries where there are private schools do not receive funding from the government at all. And there are some countries, those that you see in this part of the figure, that have very high levels of privatization. Those include regions in China, Macau, for example, is a city in China, Hong Kong. The Netherlands, Chile, and Ireland have more than 50% of students in private schools. Most of them, as you see, are private schools receiving funding from the government. Some of those are through vouchers. Countries like Korea or the United Kingdom, it's about 40% of private students in private schools. Then you have a few countries like Spain, Japan, it's about 30%. But as you see, there's a huge heterogeneity, basically. So there's no clear pattern of how many students go to private schools in different countries. Then, so is the level of privatization in the education system related or not to performance? There are different ways to see this question. One is to look at the percentage of students in private schools and relate that to the mean performance of the system. That's what's represented in this graph. Based on only that indication, there is no relationship between these two variables, either across all the participating countries in the study or only across OECD member countries. Another way to approach this question is to look at, we in the school questionnaire, we include a question that says something like, do you have to the school principal, do you have to compete with other students in your area for students? They say that right? You have to compete with other schools for students, right? So based on that, the horizontal axis here is the percentage of schools in a country that have to compete for students in order to have students to work, right, to function. So we relate that with the mean performance in mathematics of the school system, and once again, there isn't really a very strong correlation between those two things, between the level, in other words, of competition, of school competition, and the mean performance in the country. Yet another way to look at that, those two, look between country differences, we can look within countries. Here, we look at difference in the average performance of students who go to public schools and students who go to private schools, right? So, in this figure, this zero line would mean no difference. Right? So the average difference between public and private. So if there is no difference, basically that's a zero. If public schools perform better, it would be a positive number in the difference. If private schools perform better, it would be a negative number. So let's look before to these orange diamonds. What this shows is the raw difference. So basically just the difference between the average of those two. And on average in the OECD, and actually in most countries, the difference is in favor of private schools. It is larger in some countries, like this. It's about 25 points in OECD countries. And in a few countries, it's actually better for public schools. Yet, the question in the policy debate really is there something special about private schools that leads to this positive difference, right? Or, alternative hypothesis, are most of this difference explained by the kind of students that attend both schools? So we do know that socioeconomically disadvantaged schools in most countries more often go to public schools, and that private schools tend to receive more advantage socioeconomically, students from socioeconomically more advantaged families, right? So then we make an econometric model to control for differences in socioeconomic background of the students. And when we do that, it's very interesting and important because the observed difference actually changed significantly. If we see, for example, for the OECD average, the advantage of private schools, actually disappears. And it turns out that if we could say something like, if public and private schools were to receive students of the same socioeconomic background, then the difference would look more like this blue ball, circle. And actually that is the case if you see in many countries where for example, where's France here? This would be the case of France. The simple raw difference is in favor of private schools. Once you control, all that difference is explained actually for socioeconomic background of students and of the average of the school. And we actually see a public school advantage. That's not true in all cases. These empty, no-colored circles mean that there is no the difference is not statistically significant. So that basically is to say no difference. So once again, as you see, it's really hard to generalize because depending on the country, the pattern is not necessarily the same. But on average, basically this tells you that it's unclear that there are very strong advantages for private schools. Well, that analysis is based on the mean performance, right? Then we also can look at just at low performers, which is a report that was just published, this figure. This shows the odds ratios refer to the probability of being a low performer. So a probability of 1 means that the probability of being a low performance for students in private schools is just the same as that of students in public schools. So we do the same exercise here. On average, for OECD, students in OECD countries, before we take into account any other characteristics, the probability of being a low performer is actually lower for students in private schools. Once we take into account background characteristics, students in private schools are actually more likely to be low performers on average. And once again, the variation across countries is important, right? So depending on the country that you look at, you might get to find different conclusions. So it's just tells you about the complexity of interpreting this data too, right? A similar pattern when we look at the one before was private independent, this is private dependent. First advantage for private schools, but then once we control, they are actually in private schools are more likely, slightly more likely. There's not a big effect. Actually, this is for private government dependent, the effect is not statistically significant either. Okay. And then I think was our third question. So in terms of school choice, private schooling on inequality in education. One way we measure this is we have this index of social inclusion, which basically is to say to what extent within schools students from different socioeconomic backgrounds are likely to go to the same schools, or they tend to be more segregated across different schools, right? So more inclusions mean more social heterogeneity within the schools, right? And then what we see here is the more school competition there is a not that strong, but actually significant negative relationship with inclusion, meaning the more competition, the less inclusion we tend to see on average across all countries. Right? There is a lot of dispersion, so a lot of other variables are also having a role, but that's the main trend in the data. Also, we do see pretty much in all countries an important level of stratification, socioeconomic stratification between public and private schools. If we divide, this is for independent and dependent combined. Of course, the stronger the stratification, the less the equity, the equality of educational opportunity tends to be lower, right? And we do see different levels across country, but it's pretty significant that the. And then also this is an interesting figure because it goes to one of the more important assumptions of the theories about school choice, which is that families will tend to have available information and they will tend to prioritize student achievement or school quality as a reason to choose schools, right? So we asked in our questionnaire to parents about their criteria to choose schools in those countries where these choices were available, and we compared the answers between socioeconomically advantaged parents and socioeconomically disadvantaged parents. Right? This triangle refers to academic achievement as a main reason for their school choices, and these squares refer to more practical reasons or considerations, such as the distance of the school from home, the expenses of the school, which not only refer to fees, but sometimes to materials, etc., and to the existence of financial aid. So what we see here is that advantaged parents, there is a clear, strong preference for basically achievement and quality, right? Among disadvantaged parents, it's actually less clear. And in many cases, practical considerations tend to be more important than achievement. There are different ways to interpret that. One is just that they actually have the constraints of their lives are just more important, so they don't actually have the freedom to choose necessarily for the better school. So this might be explaining some of the issues that we're seeing. And finally, also we conducted an analysis comparing the effect or the difference in certification between different kinds of vouchers. For example, vouchers, what's called universal vouchers, where the opportunity to choose is offered to all families regardless of background, or targeted vouchers, which are focused only on poor, minority, disadvantaged families to attend different kinds of school. And we see that in targeted vouchers, actually, the levels of stratification in the system tend to be lower. So this is to say, in other words, the design of these kinds of policy also matter, and we might have different effects depending on how we design them. Perhaps the reason for universal vouchers to be more prone to produce socioeconomic differences is exactly what we saw here, that the way families choose are not necessarily the same, right? And there are many countries. I know personally the case of Chile. I'm from Chile originally, and a number of studies have suggested that it has been more the middle-class families that have taken advantage of vouchers and of choices, and that has created a lot of the middle-class families to leave the public system towards the private voucher system. So this is basically a summary of what I've shown. I think I'm already over my time, so I'll leave it at that, and then any questions.
Okay, so when you're ready, Brian.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. I'll talk a little bit. I don't do PowerPoint presentations. I just like to kind of talk. And I do about 40 or 50 speeches a year on school choice. And a lot of people ask me, why I do it, because I'm really busy. I have a TV show, I have radio, I have the newspapers. I play ultimate frisbee, so I'm really busy. Oh, do you? Oh, awesome! Yeah, it's my favorite. Come play with me in the U.S. anytime you want. And I do apologize for being late. I just went to the wrong building, and I was worried that you guys were all, saying, "Where's Brian? Where's Brian?" And I can assure you, I was not in the kitchen. I know there's a famous cartoon in Paris. I give a lot of speeches on school choice because I'm very passionate about the topic. Like I said, I do 40 or 50 a year. I'm a product of school choice. And so when people look at me, they're like, oh, this is a tall, white, terribly good-looking guy. He came from a wealthy family. He's had a silver spoon in his mouth. He's had everything given to him his entire life. That's actually not the case. I come from a poor family. I'm actually half Latino. I don't look it, but I can move like a Latino. My hips don't lie, as Shakira said, famously. My mom, at one point in our life, was on welfare benefits. She was on government assistance. We lived in a terrible area with very poor schools, and she realized, as I think most parents in the U.S. realize, that one of the few ways that you can actually have a better life for yourself and have a better life for your children is if you have a good, high-quality education. So my mother did something that is actually illegal in the United States, and it was before school choice was popular. She had a rich friend who lived maybe 15 minutes away from us in a very nice school district, and she used her friend's utility bill and forged it and pretended it was our address and submitted that to the school district. And much like in France, and I'm not an expert on the French education system by any stretch of the imagination, and I would never purport to be. I know that there are school districts in areas somewhat like the U.S., but different. And so if you live in a particular area, you live in a particular geography in the U.S., you are essentially trapped in that school district if you don't have the means, if your family does not have the money to pay for a private school or for another school. And so that was the case for me. So my mother, who's a very strong woman, somewhat annoying, she decided that there was no way she was going to let me have the same outcomes that she had. There was a better life for me if I had a higher quality education. And so she lied and broke the law and used her friend's address. And I can tell you this, that there is no way that I would be sitting in this room in Paris talking to you about education reform. There's no way I would be the opinion editor for two newspapers. There's no way that I would have started 2 companies. There's no way that I would have been on television unless I decided to be an actor, which maybe could have happened. I think I look a little bit like Tom Cruise. What do you think? Yeah, okay. And had she not made that choice, I would not be here in this room, and that's why I go around the country talking in great detail about it. Interestingly enough, because of different political forces in our country today, in the United States, women who do that same thing for their children have actually been punished. Actually, about 2 or 3 years ago, a mother in Ohio did the exact same thing that my mom did, and do you know what happened to her? She was thrown into jail. She was thrown into jail because she tried to get her kid out of a really poor school into a better school, and she broke the law by changing her address just to do that, because the system doesn't allow for parents to make those types of decisions. And there's a lot of debate and discussion about school choice in the United States. Unfortunately, it's not gone as far as it should. In some states, like Nevada, you've seen innovation, great innovation in terms of school choice, and you're seeing education outcomes improve. Florida is another example of that. But the problem is, from a political perspective, you have 2 major issues. One is you have wealthy conservatives in very nice districts who say, oh, no, we don't want school choice, we don't want a voucher system, because all of those kids are going to come and ruin our schools. All of those people will come and ruin our schools. And you can read into that however you want. Then, interestingly enough, there are strange allies and bedfellows in this political fight. The opposite group that hates school choice and school vouchers are the very progressive, very liberal public employee unions, because they believe by allowing a school voucher system, what would happen is bad schools would close, and thereby a bunch of teachers would lose their jobs, meaning teachers get less work, unions get less dues, it diminishes their power, and after all, one of the chief jobs for at least public employee unions in the United States is to protect the jobs of teachers, regardless if they're good or bad, regardless if the outcomes are good for students or not for students. And so it's become this very interesting hot topic in debate in the United States. And the interesting thing that I've found is that while there are 2 competing narratives here, conservatives often like to talk and Republicans often like to talk about economic freedom and liberty and choice, in the sense that we need competition, and we need these schools so that if you infuse competition into education, what will end up happening is bad schools will go out of business and good schools will flourish. And what you'd see is you'd see a system where schools that were good would have satellite campuses, and they would kind of franchise like a Starbucks or a McDonald's or something like that. And the bad schools would go out of business. And I think there's some truth to that, but I think it's also a little bit high-minded. The flip side of this is that the Democratic Party and the liberal progressive unions, who are supposed to be the agents of change that support the minority communities that oftentimes vote for them to get them into office, completely oppose a policy that helps mostly disadvantaged students in our society. You may or may not know this, because I know this is a very good school and you guys are way smarter than me. But I will say that there's some data points that are really important. In the US, when you poll African American black communities in terms of whether or not they would like a universal school choice program, the numbers are outrageous. It's over 60 or 70% of black people who would like to see school choice. Yet the leaders in the party they support, the Democratic Party, will not support, usually, school choice, school voucher programs. Similarly, as you know, our country has a large population of Latinos, and the Latino community, large percentage of Latino community, 60, 70% again, support school voucher and school choice programs. Yet we still don't see this enacted by Republicans or Democrats in various parts of our country. And that's typically because the politics have outweighed the practicality. And when someone like me starts to talk about this topic around the country, you start to see a little bit of movement. I do a lot of public radio and private radio, and it was funny, I was on this radio station, and it was a very, very liberal radio announcer on Sirius XM radio, and he told me before we were on the air, the green light's not on, we're not even on the air. He says, I just disagree with everything you believe in every part of your life. And I said, oh, really? And I was like, this is going to be a great interview. And by the end of the interview, when I told my story and I told how it impacted my life, and I talked about it in terms of minority voters, minority communities, and socioeconomic disadvantage, he actually changed his position, and now he's a big advocate for school choice in the U.S. Interestingly enough, I'm a modern guy. I still think I'm young. I just turned 35 not too long ago. And you mentioned Milton Friedman, Rose Friedman, who I admire. You also mentioned Steve Jobs. Or I think you meant Steve Forbes, though. Or was it Steve Jobs? Jobs as well. Another more modern figure who also is a big advocate and proponent of school choice, and I think he's one of the most brilliant business leaders out there. Do any of you watch Netflix? Yeah? Okay, a few of you. The CEO of Netflix is one of the most outspoken pioneers in school choice education in the U.S. and I think globally. So for me, when I come to speeches like this, it's more personal because I've actually lived it, and I don't know that I'd be in front of this room if school choice policies were not an option for me. And so my fight is to fight for it wherever possible. Now there are certain different ways you can look at school choice, especially in various education systems. I think there's some interesting and good data on the screen up here. But I think that one of the things that people forget is school choice doesn't necessarily have to be a choice between public and private schools. It can be a choice between public and public schools. And in the U.S., in areas where you see that happen, you oftentimes see the bad public schools go out of business. Also, in our system, we have public schools, we have charter schools, which are a hybrid, and then we have private schools in various locations. Another part of the discussion, the debate that I think is crucial, that's oftentimes left out in terms of school choice, is special needs students and special needs education. So if you have a student, particularly in the U.S., with a disability, say autism or some other learning disability, and you are a family that doesn't have the ability to send them to a private school or a special education school, what happens is you're put into a public school, and in that public school, they might not necessarily have the teachers or the resources to train and develop that particular type of student. But in a voucher system, even if you have a voucher system that just helps to deal with special needs students, you've already helped in terms of equity and quality of education for special needs students. So I could ramble on for a long time, but that would get boring, and I don't like to ramble. I'm happy to, I'd love to hear your thoughts and take as many questions, and that way I can talk about what you're really interested in. And also I can address some of my thoughts on the slide as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So what I would maybe like to advance in a few points and raise a few questions or
Yeah.
answer a few things.
Sure.
Oh,
Yeah, I think that we're gonna.
Well, as you wish, if you'd like to, a few thoughts which cross your mind.
I would rather wait for your.
Yeah. Well, I'd love
And for everybody's questions.
Yes, well, I'd love to know what you think about introducing choice between public and public schools, for example, without even thinking about private, public, etc.
Right.
Which you've got quite a bit on.
Yeah.
Just about
So I think I wasn't. That is one of the thoughts that I think I wasn't clear when I presented some of the slides. The slides that look at the percentage of schools who compete with other schools, that actually includes public and public schools as well. If you notice the percentage of private schools, they are actually much lower than the percentage of schools that compete against other schools for students. So that in a way is included in my presentation already, that idea. Yeah. And then, yeah, I mean, I guess as my reaction is, we really are talking about different things. I think you exposed very well sort of I would say the theory of school choice, right? The ideas why it could be a good policy. What I think is really the hard part is like, so how do we put those into practice, right? So what happens when we actually implement those? So what can we learn from countries that actually have tried to build education markets to give vouchers for all students or for some groups of students, right? And just speaking from the point of view of PISA, the benefits are not that clear. The reasons why are also, I think, should be subject to further research. Right? One is definitely, I think, that slide I show about the criteria for parents to choose. Do parents really have all the information they need to choose between schools? That's one question. Do all parents really are choosing as we would want them for the best school for their kids? Maybe not all of them. And also a question that is important, I think, is so what happened with the kids who come from families whose parents are not so proactive, who don't make those choices even if they're available? So, in a way, when some schools basically move from the quote-unquote bad school to the quote-unquote good school, what happened with everybody else who stays in the quote-unquote bad school? So how this solve that problem too? I think those are some of the questions that, at least speaking from the evidence provided by PISA, are left open when we review sort of just the theory of school.
Okay, I'd just like to bounce back on that for a question for Brian. When you see this evidence, how does that work with your narrative?
I know, 100%.
I'm just wondering, like,
no, I agree. And I was hoping for this question. No, and I think that there's different evidence. I think that there's a lot of data, and I'm happy to send it around on this very topic. But interestingly enough, I'll give Los Angeles, which is one of the largest school districts in the United States. Los Angeles is obviously the second largest community, city, county in the United States, and I'm from Los Angeles. In Los Angeles alone, when school choice and charter schools are enacted in Los Angeles, what invariably happens is the charter schools and the private schools have an incentive to market to parents in disadvantaged areas to get them to change schools for better outcomes. So they spend money, resources, and time to market to poor, disadvantaged students who might not usually have that information. And why do you actually do that? Part of it is because their mission, particularly for charter schools, is to help improve education. And they have a private, public, some have private and public funding. But there's also money involved, and money becomes the incentive for why they try to get the students. Because what happens is there are literally dollars, thousands of dollars attached to each student. So every student, if I'm a good charter, private, or public school, every student that I recruit from a different neighborhood or a different area not too far from me is another line item in my budget. It allows me to have more money to spend on teachers. It allows me to spend more money on technology. It allows me to spend more money on the quality of education in the classroom. And it allows me to work outside of many of the regulations and parameters that are hindering public schools, because the same types of rules and regulations are not on private schools or charter schools that are on public schools. So what invariably happens to those schools that are left behind? Well, a lot of students don't stay there because they realize all their friends and neighbors are going to good schools, so the bad schools end up closing. And I think that's a big part of the debate. I would say, secondly, one of the major problems that we see in school choice discussion globally, not just in the United States, but globally, and it's happening in the United States as well, is this idea that we'll allow a voucher program, and I think in many of these countries you have this, you'll allow a voucher program, but you have so many strings attached, and so many rules attached, and so many regulations, that it makes the voucher program not even useful anymore, because you're saying, we want you to run exactly like the public schools that are bad, and we recognize they're bad because of all the rules that we're giving you. And we're seeing that in the United States as well, where you see a situation where elected officials will say, great, yes, we'll give a school choice and a voucher program, but you have to have public employee unions, you have to have this rule, you have to have this rule, you have to use these standards, and you have to have these tests. And I think that's the challenge. The idea is diversity. The idea is diversity in thought and diversity of approach. No one in this room learns exactly the same way. No one in this room, I would hope, would believe that there is a one-size-fits-all model for education. The beauty of a system that allows for different types of education for different people is a system that allows you and your family to choose what is best for you. Because I assure you, if you put me in a university or a school that focused solely on biology, I would probably kill myself. But if you put me in a school that focused more on arts and sciences of other sorts, then I would thrive in that environment, communication and technology. And I think that's a very important. And I would point to a couple of data points up here. Some of the countries that have the most robust school choice programs, at least I saw, and we can go back to it, I could be wrong, and I was trying to scan very fast, are some of the countries that have some of the best education. And obviously, inclusion is an issue. For example, I think Belgium obviously has a very prominent school choice program, as does Switzerland. And when you look at some of these slides, you see that their education outcomes are very high, similar to China. And then when you see immigration from the United States, or into the United States from Chinese folks, you often see them choosing for charter schools or private schools because they're used to those types of opportunities and successes in their own country. But the broader point to your, I think, statistics is that there are so many different approaches and so many different parts that instead of allowing a market to actually develop for choice, you're seeing governments try to get involved and rig school choice in a way. And I try to get things as simple as possible, and I'm from the United States, as you all know, and for every other aspect of my life, I have freedom to do whatever I want. If I don't like the restaurant around the corner from my house, I go to the restaurant 3 blocks away. If I don't like the coffee shop, which is Starbucks on every corner, I can go to a different coffee shop that's down the street. If I don't want to shop at the clothing store by my house, I can go to a clothing store 10 minutes away. I have the choice to do that in every single aspect of my life. The only one that I do not have in our country, universally, is to choose the outcome of school for myself and my kids. I don't have any kids, but if I did.
Yeah, any questions? Please.
Yeah, I would like to come back on that. Thank you very much, mostly for your talk. My problem is, how can you tackle the problem of saturation? Let's suppose there is information available for everyone, okay? We are rational, so we're all going to go for the best school, but at one moment, there is going to be selection. How can you, like first, who will decide? What are the selection criteria? Is it going to be money, for example? You can't really put all people in the same franchise because it does not work like that. Facilities do not work like that. So how do you tackle it?
And that's the biggest challenge. I don't know if you've seen, there's a movie called Waiting for Superman. It was a big documentary film. David Guggenheim did it. He was the same one who did the climate change documentary with Al Gore. And it's called Waiting for Superman. And it addresses this very issue. One of the biggest challenge, I think, for the school choice movement is in areas where you see choice starting to work, you see really good schools overwhelmed. And one of the ways, unfortunately, that they're trying to deal with it is a lottery system. So literally parents will come into a room larger than this, and they'll each get a number, and they shake up the numbers and pick the number. And if you're lucky enough to get that number, you're able to get into the class. In some other cases, it could be other factors as well. But I think that I would argue, I guess right now, is that there's not enough widespread school choice for this to become such a problem. And I would believe and hope, and I would probably help start these, but the more you see an opportunity to start and be entrepreneurial and build a school, start a new school, you should start one. Because the attitude is if there's demand, there will be supply. And so I don't think that we've gotten to a point where, at least in the United States, this has become a horrible problem, except in very specific areas. There's a couple areas in New York. Go ahead.
Yeah, you're talking about supply and demand. The problem is there can be demand, but this demand has some revenue, like less.
Sure,
less. So if I'm starting my own business, I want it to be profitable. It could be profitable if I go into the low-cost education system, but as a even as a poor parent, I don't want my child to go into really like low-cost kind of education. So it doesn't really work like that for me. But my problem is, why don't you tackle the issue at its core? Just like increase funding for all the schools. Why can't you just go to the poor districts where you have really poor systems, and then you will increase the probability to get good education, because your solution is lottery, and lottery would increase on average maybe the education opportunities that poor people will have. But if you increase funding for their schools, maybe you get better education for everyone. Maybe it's better than lottery.
Maybe. Yeah, I wouldn't argue that this is a luxury at all, especially considering there's a lot of private dollars that go to it and also public dollars. And I haven't found that there are many luxury. And there are school choice programs in the United States that specifically carve out certain types of private schools. So that if it's a private school that's particularly affluent and endowed, it couldn't get or it couldn't realize the scholarships or the voucher system. I would argue that there is no data that I've seen that proves, particularly in U.S. schools, that giving more money to a school district improves economic or educational outcomes. If you throw, for example, you drive a car that's not a very good car. It's a bad car. It always breaks down. It never wants to fix itself. Someone says, okay, we're going to throw $1 million into this car. Over and over, you throw $1 million into this car. Why would you throw $1 million into this broken down car and try to fix up the car when you can spend $100,000 on a Tesla that's down the street? It's not efficient, it's not effective. And so the issue becomes that when you continue to throw money into a bad school system, you don't really address the problems. The problems aren't necessarily the money. The problems are bad teachers. The problems are bad administration. The problems are spending too much money on administration. The problems are the approach to education. So what happens when you put more money into a low-performing school district or more money into a school district in the United States, it doesn't necessarily improve economic outcomes. What it does is it gives raises to the principal, it gives raises to the administration, it gives raises to the teachers, it maybe hires a few other teachers, and what happens? The students never benefit. So from my perspective, I would rather have a new system and have a new product and have a new innovative school that has a chance of being successful, not bound by the ways of the past. And the issue becomes that, much like various aspects of society, when you get to a place of stagnation, you don't see improvement. And that's probably my best argument for that. But that's one of the big arguments that you'll see from the public sector unions in the United States, most particularly, is we just need to give more money to schools, give more money to schools, give more money to schools. And we've tried that. We've tried it in California, we've tried it in Los Angeles, we've tried it in New York, we've tried it in other parts of the country. And the only thing thus far in my lifetime that's had measurable effect on the quality of education is the infusion of additional choices in schools. And many of those are charter schools. And that's why you have such a powerful and growing charter school movement in the United States.
I was wondering if you have an opinion on funding about public schools, if it should increase funding or not, and if funding of public schools has a relation with their outcome. I know in France, for example, the funding of schools is quite high and the results aren't.
So yeah, well, the OECD and PISA in particular has actually a lot of data on funding, on resources, and the effect of more resources in schools. That we can look in the United States and in other countries, in all OECD countries and all partner countries that are part of PISA. And yeah, so what we see is that actually having an adequate amount of resources of different kinds that go from infrastructure, educational materials such as textbooks, computers, then qualified teachers. All those things do have an effect and do matter for the quality of education and for student performance, up to a certain point. Right? So there is something like a strong correlation that stops at some point, which corresponds pretty much to what is today the average level of funding in OECD countries for the average school. And then on top of that, so when you reach that basic necessary level of resources, of funding, two things are being important for the performance of the whole system. One is, well, how are those resources being used within schools, right? Are they being put into practice? Like, for example, we had a recent report on computers and education. There are many countries that have invested a lot in computers, on tablets, different kinds of technologies. So far, there is very, very weak evidence that that's making any difference at all. Yet, because one of the hypotheses is that actually schools are not yet prepared to use that materials in a way that makes a difference in education. Many teachers don't have necessarily the training to even know what to do with a tablet. There are not necessarily materials, curriculum materials developed yet that are adequate for the two purposes. And the second thing is actually the equity of the distribution of those resources within the system. Because many systems, and actually the United States is an example, they might have a certain average level of resources in schools, but when you see difference across school districts, for example, there are massive differences. And the more unequal distribution of resources in your system is, the lower the average level of performance, right? So that is an important thing. And then in terms of also just going back to the school choice issue, so yeah, I mean, one way to look at it is in terms of resources. And then also it's so as I was saying, given that there is weak evidence that countries with more choice have better performance, we actually do have really strong evidence that countries that do a number of different things are much more likely to get a better performance. Like teachers is the best example. Like countries that really have strong teacher careers that are able to, where the teaching profession is valued, is well paid, is competitive, they really have to pass competitive examinations to become teacher, and then you have like a nice prospect, professional prospect for the rest of your life, which is actually the main characteristics of all the top performing East Asian countries in PISA. I mean, that we do have strong evidence that that actually makes a difference. So those are the kinds of things that we also have to take into account when we talk about this thing.
So, yeah, Brian was mentioning examples of Switzerland or Belgium. What does PISA data have to say about?
The thing is, right, so there are countries with perhaps a lot of choice that have good results, but there are also countries that have a lot of choice that have low results.
Okay.
So then, on average, you find like that's not a guarantee, right? So it's more like you have both extremes. You see, that's why the correlation is 0.
Yeah.
So then, what are the conditions? I guess that's just we have to keep thinking about that. It's not just like an easy formula. You actually have to go and see yourself, well, what do those countries do that actually might lead to a successful implementation of this?
And I would add, there's no substitute, I think, for a good teacher. I mean, if you have a really high quality teacher in the classroom, you're going to have a good education experience, whether it's a public or private school. One of the reasons that I think that you get better teachers in private schools and charter schools, particularly in the United States, is because the rules for hiring and firing are a lot different. So you can hire teachers, and you can set up your own training and education, and compensation is usually higher for teachers at private schools, so you're recruiting and attracting better teachers. Similarly, if you realize that you've hired someone and they don't do a very good job, it's much easier to fire a teacher or change a teacher or remove a teacher in a private system or in a charter system, which is a quasi-public-private system, than in a public system.
What I suggest is we're going to take 3 questions at a time to make it easier.
Okay, well,
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about two things that are not exactly related to school choice, but close.
Please don't ask about Donald Trump.
No, it's about education. No, about school diversity and school autonomy, whether it is public or private. Is there evidence that high centralization and lack of autonomy for teachers and for head of institutions is bad for school results, from PISA evidence or not? And also about and I think you mentioned it both, about teachers. I think France is the only country in the world, not the only one of the few that I know, where being a teacher is not a job. Like, you get out of college and you are a teacher. Like, you don't have a path to teachers at university. It's pretty striking, and my friends from different countries in Europe are shocked that you don't study to be a teacher, you study 5 years of philosophy, and then you're a teacher. And what does PISA say about it? Is it clear that it's absurd, or no? I mean, because I don't understand that. So.
Yeah, it's a really good question.
It's not about school choices, but it's about the content of the course. Because actually I met an Indian guy this weekend. It's funny because I met you now. And he told me that when he was young, he besides the classic school, he learned the art of life. I mean, he learned how to eat with a healthy way. And this kind of education transmit like peace messages, to be more tolerant, some stuff like that. And why not like meditation and this kind. And I want to ask you, what do you think about this proposition, and why don't we introduce this kind of courses in the the traditional system of education?
Last question. Well,
Yeah, I actually have a comment to what he asked as well. Like, he talked about the improving autonomy. In fact, just this morning we saw that Finland, which is an example, like, they absolutely don't tell their teachers what to do, and each school has the highest amount of autonomy. They do not follow like the national curriculum which is imposed, and they have some of the best results in student outcomes. My question, so I have one very fundamental question actually. So before I walked in here, I wasn't very sure of what a school voucher is, but what I can see is it's an opportunity where the state funds the student to go and study in a private school rather than a public school?
It could be state or federal funding. It's funding that the student can take with them wherever they want to go. So they can go to a public school, a private school, a charter school. That's a quick question, maybe.
Okay, but they can choose to go to a public school as well with that funding,
Yes.
not necessarily
Yes.
a private school.
Yes.
Okay, then this question stands cancelled. But I have a second no, because then the definition here is wrong. But I have a second question.
That's one of the arguments you'll hear is that people who don't like school choice say it only goes to private school. It's, it helps.
Yeah, because then there would be no
teach people.
incentive for a public school to improve, and that's
Exactly.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
Okay, second was very interesting about your personal experience about social cohesion and how your mother had to do something illegal to actually get you into a school of what she thought would be best for you. And I think it's a problem like everywhere in the world that, we have these social circles, and the moment you belong either geographically or socially to a certain circle, you are sort of bound by that circle for life. And what do you think would be some policies or some things to look forward to break out of these circles apart from doing things illegally?
And I should have articulated that better. And I just want to answer this really quickly because I'll forget. I'm a little bit jet lagged and hungover, so no, I'm just kidding. I will be tomorrow. But one of the main reasons that I'm really passionate about school choice is I think it also infuses diversity, socioeconomic diversity, but also racial diversity into the school system. The United States has a history, obviously, of racism. You all know this. And segregated schools that were forced segregated schools by mandate. I would argue today, and this is even hard to say because I love my country, obviously, but our schools in the United States are still in many ways segregated. And they're segregated along socioeconomic lines. And those socioeconomic lines oftentimes help with the segregation among racial boundaries. I mean, there are neighborhoods with very bad underperforming schools where it's all black kids, or mostly black kids. You have the same with Latino communities. You have the same with white communities in parts of the South and Middle America. But that segregation still exists, and I think it's largely because of the school system that we've allowed to continue on, and we need to adapt to modern times. And I don't think, to your point, that school choice is the silver bullet, but I think it's a start in making sure that we start opening up in terms of performance and diversity. And I hope we get to a problem where the schools are oversaturated, because we have to find a solution to that. But that's one of the main problems, I think, of our current education system in the US. But I think it's improving slightly.
I'll just repeat quickly the 4 questions. So one of them was about the impact of school autonomy and performance. The other one was on teacher training. Should we learn about life as a course in high school? And the last one is the importance of social networks and how can we break from such types of social networks.
Yes, so I think this has pretty strong evidence also on decentralization and autonomy. What's that question? Yeah. So what we find here actually is that, in theory, giving more decisions to schools makes perfect sense. Like, they know better, like, what their students in the first place, they know better their needs, etc. Right? At the same time, the more decisions you give to the local level, how efficient that use of resources is, or the decision making, it depends also on the capabilities and the capacity of the schools and of the actors at the local level, right? So, what PISA found is actually that school autonomy tends to be positively related to performance under certain conditions, mostly when there are strong accountability mechanisms in place. So that schools have to actually can be held accountable to the communities, to the families, to, I don't know, information in performance is public, etc. So when autonomy and accountability tend to go together, which is not necessarily always the case, and usually stronger accountability schemes might require stronger regulations for those schools, that tends to work better. That's, I think, one of the, at least was one of the conclusions of the last PISA report. About teachers, well, it's clearly just what I said before, that like the stronger the teacher career path, the stronger the training, the certification, the professional development, that pays off in terms of the quality of education. The French case, I mean, I'm also not a specialist in the France case, but yeah, it seems it's different from what we see in the best performing countries. Don't put it that way. Then in terms of like the what should we teach in schools, like should we teach stuff like the course of life, I think you said, or something like that. I mean, yeah, that's really like it's a different kind of debate, like it's more of a normative debate. What do we want education to be? I do think that in practice, even today, schools teach much more than we actually measure. I mean, the study like PISA just measures mathematics, but then teachers actually, that's one of the reasons why, that's one of the limitations of the study as well, that teachers in practice and schools do teach much more than just this already, I think. I don't know if like formally they're, what exactly could we like consider? I guess the courses of life would also be what's useful for students in different countries or contexts could vary as well, right? I think that, I mean, in any case, like, I think if we, it is important to get the basic right. Like, if students don't really reach baseline levels of proficiency in reading or mathematics, I think that keeps as the traditional sort of focus of the education curriculum. It's important to get that basic right. But I mean, I think it would be interesting, like, to explore also like these kinds of things. But also, I think that's a more normative discussion. I mean, it's a more general. There isn't really a lot that PISA can say about that.
And I think both of your questions go hand in hand. And I'm not, I know you're, and I'm getting my pronunciation of anything French is terrible, but I think your former minister is Najat Balud, is that right? Yeah, former Minister of Education? Both, okay. And you know, we had similar foreign ministers, I guess we call them secretaries of education in the US at the federal level, and we have them almost at every state, so all 50 states. And my attitude is that these organizations, these nationalized or statewide approaches to education should be very simple, dealing with the basics, and they should be best practices organizations. The most innovation and the best increases in quality of education are happening at local levels and localities. And I mentioned earlier that, you know, people learn differently in different communities. How someone would learn in Los Angeles, California, versus how someone might learn in the South or in Ohio or wherever is much different, and the realities of life are much different as well. And I think that one of the things that you see happen is you have regulations and policies dictated from a federal level. One teacher described it to me as having 90% of the rules and 10% of the funding coming from the federal government. And it causes a real problem because it forces teachers in the United States in particular to do what they commonly call as teach to the test. So basically they're all teaching just so students do well on these national evaluations. So they look good, the school district looks good, but it curbs innovation in the classroom. And so I actually teach two classes. I don't teach it at K through 12 schools. I teach one undergraduate course at Chapman University in the United States, and I teach a graduate level course at Pepperdine University in the US. And the rule of the contract that I sign with both schools is that I don't follow your rules, I don't do your curriculum, I teach the class that I want to teach. And both classes are among the most popular classes on campus because not only do I teach them philosophy, I also teach them practical, real-world stuff. And I think one of the things that's lacking in public education and private education is a real-world discussion about what you should realistically know and expect when you leave college or even high school, for that matter. One of the things that I think is hilarious is that I have friends who who don't know how to do a basic budget for themselves, their household, and they go into debt, and then they say, how did I get into debt? And I was like, well, every night when I was at home cooking and saving money, you were out at the bar drinking Patron shots. So I think that's why you have a large credit card bill. But things like basic budgeting, I think things like, we've cut out a lot of the really important, I think, quality normative courses in the US, such as, cooking, or stuff like that's been lost, but I think it's so important to the development of a young person. So I think that allowing a teacher to recognize what the needs of his or her students are in the classroom is critically important to student success. Because like we said, I think the one thing we all can agree on is that the quality of a teacher is the most important thing. And so let the teacher do her or his job and figure out what the students most need. And I think secondly, offering some baseline curriculum that includes the real world would be particularly helpful for people who are coming out of school, because as we're seeing with this presidential election in the US, many of the people who feel angry or disenfranchised feel that they've been somehow let down by society, and that's partially, I think, the fault of the education system.
Do you have just anything to say about the social networks question?
So what exactly was the question?
Break from the social networks. I think perhaps the larger question is, how do you misuse information if you're in a low-income background about the performance of the different schools?
I see.
Is that sort of the question?
Basically, like breaking out of socially set circles of economic or social disadvantage. Breaking out of this sort of thing that restricts you, because like either geographically or socially, the moment you're born into this world, like you are, you belong to a certain class or section of society, and that often inhibits the choices you make.
Yes.
So, relation to that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to break that. I think actually that you raised that is interesting because some studies that look into how families make school choices. So how are families actually getting information about what's the best school? I mean, right? How do they know actually what schools is the best one compared to their school, right? So some districts, some countries provide sort of this public information about student performance, for example. That's publicly available. But then actually there are really few families that actually go and get that information, or that actually are, if they receive it in the newspaper, they actually know how to read it very well, or they actually think that that information is important at all. What actually matters the most, according to some studies, some of them in the US, in Australia, in the UK, actually in Chile too, is that most families hear their social networks. They like talk to some friend who, so what do you know about these schools? So most of the information about the schools come from those networks. And as you say, because these networks are indeed sort of embedded in the social structure, right? Like in the social class, in the ethnic groups, in the neighborhoods. People tend to get information from very restricted circles. That, in a way, tends to make that your school choices are very driven by that. As a result, like, people from different social classes tend to choose schools that are similar. People from like middle classes choose more middle class schools. Poor families choose more poor schools. That's one argument of why, or actually one empirical finding of qualitative studies that suggests why some of the expectations or assumptions of the theory don't happen in practice the way that we would want or expect.
Considering the time, we'll take two last questions, and please keep them nice and short.
So I just wanted to ask about PISA testing. So the PISA as a system sort of has survived some of the critics because of the fact that there are standardized tests, and as such have obvious sort of negative effects on racing to the test. And you also mentioned that, for example, kids start using tablets, right? So we can't really measure that impact, or the tests are not designed to measure an impact of tablets, right, in school. So what would you say would you predict to be a development in PISA testing? Is there any sort of probability that they're going to change or develop differently? And what is sort of the space for innovation within the whole body? And then I also have a question for you. I don't know if you touched upon this because I was late, but what would you say is the role of incentives in the voucher system? And if you can expand on incentives, maybe a bit.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's good. My question goes to you, Brian. I'd like to ask you a pretty simple and practical question about a voucher system. Let's say we implement a voucher system. How can we value the voucher? How can we set up the amount of money we allow a student to spend in education?
Yes, no, thank you for the question. That's actually an important question, and some of the criticisms to PISA are important. Well, all areas of life, criticism is an important thing. So, yes, in terms of innovation, so how PISA sort of goes beyond the mathematics, reading, and science. So, like you say, maybe like these tablets are generating something else that's not measured in the test. In recent cycles of PISA, PISA has actually added what's been called the innovative domain of assessment to the PISA cycle. So in addition to the traditional core subjects, new dimensions that relate to different other things that might be affected by school are being measured. Let me give you some examples. Like, one was in the last cycle already, actually, some of the stuff that you were mentioning about like being able to make a budget at home. That was, there was a special assessment about financial literacy of students. So are students able to do those kinds of things that are important to them? Another, problem solving, like how, there was a different innovative assessment, like not only mathematics, but different kinds of problems that students might face in their lives. How are they able to solve problems and have the skills to creatively do that? In the most recent, now actually 2015, the results are going to be published later this year. The innovative assessment was student well-being. So where students actually feel about themselves, what do they do in their free time, do they like to go to school, all these, a lot of things that are not related with their academic performance, but with their life beyond and at school, like their health, their...
And that gets counted in?
And that is also like, there is a, an instrument to measure those things, whether it's to measure the student well-being of each individual student, but also like the average well-being of students in different systems. And we can, with that data, we can actually also compare like what kinds of systems. For example, if perhaps it could be the case that very top-performing countries have really very low levels of well-being. Maybe not. We don't really know that. We don't have the data yet, but it could be the case. Like the stress levels are just so high that one sort of, you know, those. So that is the way, like, in which PISA has sort of like worked into incorporating new dimensions that are also important for education into the study.
And so on your two questions, for me, they're actually, they go together a little bit. So I'm going to answer yours first because it helps me answer yours. In the US, it's actually kind of the easy proposition because the way school funding works now is if you're in a public school, the school is given a certain amount of dollars per that student. So say just for round numbers, it's $10,000. So every student who goes to a public school, that school district gets $10,000 for that student, which is the annual budget for the school. In the world of school choice, it would work that $10,000 is attached to the student, and wherever the student goes, that school gets that $10,000, which goes to your point about incentives. But you actually made me think about something that I don't think anyone's talking about, and now I'm going to write about it and probably talk about it. And it actually helps with some of the other problems people have, I think, over here with school choice. But on one side, the incentive for the educational institution or for the school is they get that $10,000 from another district. So they're bringing in more piles of money for every student that they bring in, bringing their budget higher. So that's the incentive, I think, for the education. Obviously, for the students and for the parents, it's so they get to go to a better school where they actually have a chance at a better life and a better education. But one of the big issues, I think, that we've discussed and raised tonight, and I think it was very evident in your slide, which is great, and then also the couple other people touched on as well, is that it's not easy to necessarily communicate that information or incentivize parents, particularly poor parents, in areas where they don't know that they have educational opportunities. And so what ends up happening is they make choices based on what's easiest for them. Because like my mother wasn't necessarily focused on, researching who had the best school. She just heard from her friend that her friend lived in a wealthy area and it was a good school. My mom was worried about putting food on the table and making sure the lights stay on and paying the rent. And so she was working 3 jobs, so she couldn't focus on those things like other parents might be able to. And so you have to really directly reach out to those parents and educate them. So maybe, and this is something we haven't explored in the US, but it might be an opportunity, is that if part of the voucher system was that $10,000 went to the school the parent chose, the student chose, but also give a cash incentive or a rebate to the families, in addition to that, for choosing to go to a different school or for a higher quality school, for using the school choice program system. So that might be a way to help market to disadvantaged communities, but also incentivize the families and the teachers as well. I'm just thinking it out loud right now. I'll think better when I drink later.
Okay. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we've explored quite a few themes tonight. One theme we haven't explored is the question of diplomas, and are diplomas even necessary? And so, for example, in France, the École 42 in Paris was founded by Xavier Niel, and basically you don't even need a baccalaureate to get in. In fact, 30% of the students don't even have a baccalaureate. But the school produces France's top engineers, software engineers and IT guys. And so we'll be exploring the themes of are diplomas necessary, etc. in a future conference in a few months' time with people from the École 42 and with other people. And so there's another conference coming up.
Yeah, so we're organizing a conference
Terra
on the financing of higher education. It's going to be in French. It's the 21st of April at 7:15 as well. So hot topic coming up soon.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions and thank you for the help.